When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. When I was 13 years old, I took a trip with my church youth choir. The youth choir went on a trip to England, the one place that I had always wanted to go. We sang at several cathedrals and did a lot of sightseeing. We saw Stonehenge and went to Westminster Abbey, and being a good Methodist, we went to see John Wesley's Cathedral. One day on our tour, we went to visit Coventry and pulled up in front of a very modern, frankly not all that impressive cathedral. As we piled off the bus, I wondered why we were even stopping there. As we went around the corner, I saw why. The outer walls of the old cathedral, a medieval masterpiece, had survived the bombing of the cathedral in November 1940, the height of the Blitz. Nothing else had. The windows gone, the roof fallen in, utter devastation. And not just the cathedral. That night, 568 people were killed, approximately 1,200 people were injured, 863 of them seriously. Nearly 8,000 houses were either destroyed outright or required evacuation for repair. The next day, Richard Howard, the provost of the cathedral, chalked on the wall of the ruined sanctuary the words, "Father, forgive them." Later, when it was safe to inspect the still smoldering ruin, the cathedral stonemason found 2 of the roof beams, still linked together, charred and twisted though they were, forming a cross. Forbes set the beams up behind an altar made from the rubble. Our tour guide that day told us that the first service said was for the souls of the German pilots, as well as for those killed in the air raid. The altar simply read, "Father, forgive." As I stood in the middle of the ruined cathedral that day, long after the others wandered into the shiny new one, I couldn't take my eyes off that cross, off that inscription, "Father, forgive." With their cathedral in large parts of the city destroyed, who could blame the people of Coventry if they wanted revenge, or even if they just wanted safety in the defeat of the invaders? But they forgave. And this is an act of forgiveness that was not done after the fact from a position of safety. In fact, the people of Coventry forgave their attackers even when the forces of evil looked to be poised to triumph over them. They prayed for their attackers to be forgiven when it looked like the damage that was done was not just incalculable, but it was irreparable. They forgave when it seemed like all that they had was lost. A few weeks later, on Christmas Day, the provost of the cathedral spoke over the radio from the ruins. He asked those who were listening to banish all thoughts of revenge and called on them to work towards a kinder, simpler world, a more Christ-like world. Father, forgive them. Friends, we're a long way from that kinder, simpler world that the cathedral provost prayed for back all those years ago on Christmas Day, here this afternoon in 2018. On this Good Friday, I turn on the news and we hear about the protests that are going on in Sacramento over the killing of Stephon Clark. Last weekend, thousands of us rallied together and marched all over the world for the safety of our children, and for gun control. We are working for justice. We are working so this president and administration does not continue to try to turn back time. We are working for a kinder, simpler world that is filled with love and forgiveness, but we still have so much work to do. Father, forgive them. Forgive them is the first word that Jesus uttered from the cross, his prayer for us all those years ago and his prayer for us today. But friends, some days I think about how hard it is to forgive. When my heart is so heavy thinking about all the families in Parkland, the family of Stephon Clark, and so many others. But I am reminded of a story today that we remember all too well. On June 17, 2015, that day when a white supremacist entered a historic African-American church in downtown Charleston, South Carolina. He was invited to join in on a Bible study. He sat with them and pretended to listen. Then, as they bowed their heads to pray and close in prayer, he shot and killed 9 church members in cold blood. But at his trial, it became clear that he hoped his actions would incite a race war. However, the response of the victims' families was the opposite of what he'd hoped for. At the shooter's first court appearance, relatives of people slain were able to speak directly to the man who stood accused of murdering those they loved. The Washington Post reported, one by one, those who chose to speak did not turn to anger. But what they did, friends, they offered him forgiveness, and they said they were praying for his soul. Jesus said, Father, forgive them. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Friends, forgiveness, though, is not forgetting. Desmond Tutu reminds us of this when he writes, forgiveness is not forgetting. It is actually remembering. Remembering, not letting people off the hook, and not using your right to hit back. It is a second chance for a new beginning. And the remembering part is particularly important because especially if you don't want to repeat what happened. Forgiveness is an act of the will. It is an act of the will that frees us. Jesuit priest Father James Martin reminds us of this when he says, forgiveness frees a person from the prison of resentment. The only thing to do is to forgive, he says, because it's the only thing that can free both parties. It frees one person from the prison of resentment and from seeing that as the other is less than human. And it frees the other person in the same way. Friends, we see that Jesus knows this. Jesus not only tells us several times in the Gospels to forgive, but shows us this. He is teaching us even from the cross. Jesus cries out, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Friends, forgiveness stretches through time, through generations, through space, through gender, through age. Not only did Jesus pray for those on Calvary's Hill, but for us and for generations to come. He is praying for us today to forgive. Jesus forgives our past. Jesus forgives what we did last night, and Jesus forgives the thing that we did years ago that still keeps us up at night. Friends, Jesus' readiness to forgive flowed from the love of God, to which he had inextricably bound himself, so that he can no longer be defined or tossed to and fro by the actions of even sinful, violent actions of others. But the true power of God, the power of love, cannot be mitigated or tempered by force. God's loving forgiveness transcends deserving and undeserving. So let me say that again, because it is so important that Jesus reminds us that first and foremost on the cross. God's loving forgiveness transcends deserving and undeserving. It transcends even virtue and unvirtue. Father, forgive them.